I want to talk to you about what I've learned in 33 years of working against genocide. And I have entitled my talk, Why Do We Look the Other Way? Because it arises from work that I have been doing with a social psychologist at the University of Oregon named Paul Slovic. Dr. Paul Slovic has done some very interesting social psychology experiments in which he has asked the question, why is it that we have such a hard time identifying with the suffering of people halfway around the world? And the social scientific experiment that he has used has been to show a picture of an African child. Her name is Rokia, and he says, now, we have here $5. I'm going to put it in your hands. Rokia is starving to death. Would you give this money? I promise you it will go directly to an organization that will feed Rokia. And he found that over half of the people that he would do that with would say yes. And then he would show another picture of a young boy named Musa. These were both people from Mali. And he said, now here's Musa, and here's $5. Would you give this money to help him so he wouldn't starve to death? Again, about half the people said yes. Then he'd show them two pictures together, Rokia and Musa. And he would say, okay, now Rokia and Musa are two children in Mali who we know are starving to death. And here's $5. And would you contribute this to an organization such as World Vision or CARE or one of the really reliable organizations, accountable organizations, in order to feed these two children? The number of people who will give the money drops to about 21%. He then shows them these two children again and says, these people, these two children, represent about 10 million African children who are starving right now. Will you give this $5 to, again, the same kinds of organizations, World Vision or CARE or the World Food Program or some other organization that is in fact very reliable about getting food to people? The number of people who would give the $5 drops to about 7%. Dr. Slovic asks the question, why is it that when presented with a single photograph, people will react so much more strongly than they will when confronted with a mass catastrophe? And he is convinced that this is one of the reasons why we have such a hard time taking action against genocide. Even after the genocide is on our TV screens, even after it is genocide in Darfur that's on the TV screens all around the world practically every night, or in the Nuba Mountains right now, or in Syria, or in Rwanda. Do you know what was on the air at the same time as the Rwanda genocide? The high-speed chase of O.J. Simpson down the freeways of Los Angeles. That got more news coverage than all the news coverage of the Rwandan genocide during that entire year. There were also, of course, upcoming South African elections, so the entire press was basically down in South Africa. Hardly any press stayed in Rwanda. And all the diplomats immediately left. The first thing that the American embassy did was decide to pull out. So we had no observers on the ground. There was only one American who stayed in Rwanda throughout the genocide. A real hero. He was a Seventh-day Adventist missionary, and when asked why he was staying, he said, I cannot leave when my people here, who I work with, would die if I did. It is so hard for us to understand why we have this trouble understanding what Paul Slovic calls, quote, psychic numbing. he says we get so used to these kinds of horrible statistics from around the world that we literally become numb to them. He believes that actually human beings are hardwired to be small group animals, basically. We are used to living in small groups. That is how we evolved, and it is why it is so hard for us to understand or to respond to people who are not in our small group. So the question is, and so, in fact, this is his equation. He says the more victims, the less the compassion. It is really a very troubling result from his experiments. So what shall we do about this fundamental problem? Well, first of all, we have to know that the disaster is happening. And we have to be able to predict that it is going to happen. So that is why Genocide Watch, since 1999, has developed an early warning system to essentially start warning about the early warnings of genocidal behavior long before genocide occurs. We developed an 8-stage model of the genocidal process. If you can look it up on our website, I recommend our brochure. Please have somebody pass that through the audience and get it to you. And it doesn't have the 8 stages on there, but they're very simple. They're very logical, really. First, you classify the population. Then you symbolize those classifications. Then you dehumanize the people that you're going to kill. Then you organize killing squads, killing groups. And then fifth, you polarize the population so those who are not with you are against you. Sixth, you prepare for the genocide by planning it and also by persecuting the group that you're about to kill. Seventh, you actually carry out the genocide. That's the extermination phase. That's the genocide. That's what meets the legal definition. And then finally, and at first I thought that was the only ones. The 7 were, that was the end of it. The 8th stage in every genocide is denial. It actually begins right at the beginning of the genocide, and it can carry on for 100 years later or more. I talked to already earlier about how America really hasn't faced up to its history about our treatment of Native Americans. And there are other countries, too, that have simply refused to face up to their histories. My own view is, you know, it was our ancestors, so let's just tell the truth and move on and figure out ways that we can prevent. But our early warning system essentially can predict genocide sometimes years in advance. In 1989, I actually lived in Rwanda. I was doing a project for USIA, the U.S. Information Agency. I was still a law professor. And they asked me to come in and take a look at the justice system, try to make it work better. And one of the things I recommended is that they readopt the gacaca system, the traditional system of justice in Rwanda, because it works. And they said, oh, it's primitive. We can't do that. I said, it's not primitive. It's just Rwandan. It's African. It works. So readopt it. You know, it's going to, when people have disputes about cattle ownership or things like this, let them use this system. Don't take it to a Belgian-style court where it takes 6 years to get through the court. They weren't ready to do that then, 1989. But another thing that really struck me that year were the identity cards, because I saw these identity cards. Right there on the identity card, it said Tutsi, Hutu, Twa, and naturalized. And they would cross out everything you weren't and leave the one thing that you were. So the ones who were Tutsis, is very clear. It's right on your ID card. And Justice Kavaruganda, who was the president of the Supreme Court, and I had dinner one night, and I said, you know, this is a real problem. He, by the way, was a moderate Hutu. And I said, can't you in the Supreme Court strike this down as unconstitutional, you know, violating equal protection of the laws and so forth? He said, unfortunately, we don't have judicial review here in Rwanda, so we can't. So you're going to have to make an appointment with the president. So I did. I went in and saw President Habyarimana. He thanked me for the work that I was doing and so forth. It was a very cordial visit. And then at the end, I brought up the ID cards. And I said, you know, these ID cards could be used for genocide. And all of a sudden, it was like a glass mask fell down in front of his face. He didn't want to hear this. I said to him, you have to get these ethnic identities off of these ID cards. Really. I said, if you let things keep going as they're currently going, you are going to have a genocide within 5 years. And I nailed it right to the year when the Rwandan genocide happened, 1994. You could see it coming. It was like a hurricane, you know, or even the kind of small tremors that signal the beginning of an earthquake, or the eruption of a volcano. I mean, these were things actually that are less predictable than a genocide. Genocide is actually more predictable than any of those things. But we've made some progress, at least with early warning. And we've also created this UN Special Advisor for Prevention of Genocide, who has developed a system of early warning. We've also had rapid response in the case of a few genocides in East Timor, in Kosovo, in Ivory Coast. I mean, these were incipient genocides. The one in the Ivory Coast was simply stopped in its tracks when essentially the country was divided in half. Again, it was very neo-colonialist, but the French really, really acted fast. They said, we don't want a genocide here. We've also taken very strong and quick action to stop some genocides in Ethiopia and Sierra Leone. And we've created international tribunals to try genocidists in the former Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in Sierra Leone, in East Timor, and Cambodia. And finally, we have an international criminal court. And despite its flaws, I think it's one of the greatest achievements that we have made in the rule of law in world history. The UN Security Council has even referred the situation in Darfur to the ICC. I mean, that's a remarkable thing. Just think about it. And I remember, because I was part of this decision, I was not in the State Department anymore, but Nick Rostow, who was the legal advisor to the UN ambassador to the United Nations, was a classmate of mine at Yale Law School. We used to sit in the back row, you know, and write notes back and forth, making fun of the professors, things like that. But anyway, we basically, you know, he was a Reagan conservative, hard rock Reagan conservative, totally opposed the ICC. I, an Obama Democrat, he knew that. But I said, Nick, you know, I think you can write a resolution that will prevent the U.S. citizens from being subject to the jurisdiction of the ICC and yet still refer Darfur to the ICC. Sure enough, he did. And so we were able to abstain on that resolution instead of voting against it. And it went through the Security Council, and that's why President Bashir has been indicted by the ICC. And the same thing happened, of course, as you remember, in Libya. And on that one, we voted for it. Didn't just abstain, we voted for it. We had a different president. So we've made progress. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda has finished 50 trials, has convicted 29 persons. The Cambodian tribunal has sentenced Comrade Doik to life in prison. And the surviving leaders of the Khmer Rouge are finally on trial 30 years after I founded the Cambodian Genocide Project while I was still a student. Keep that in mind, you students. Still a student at Yale Law School in 1982. I came back from Cambodia having worked there in 1980 to direct the relief program. And I said, these Khmer Rouge have got to be put on trial. And so some of the professors said, well, go around to the human rights organizations, see if they'll take this case on. This is going to take a lot of work. So I did. And none of them would touch it. They said, this is just too big for us. And also, it's in the past. I said, it is not in the past. The Khmer Rouge are up there on the border, and they still want to take Cambodia over again. And so I came back to Yale, and I said, nobody will do it. And so Mars McDougall, one of the greatest law professors who ever lived, looked me in the eye and said, well, why don't you do it? And I said, but I'm just a law student. And then in the exercise of total Ivy League arrogance, he said, yes, but you're a Yale law student. And I always told my students, and it didn't matter whether I was teaching at Washington Lee or at Mary Washington or as I am now at George Mason, I don't care where they're a student. They can start changing the world before they're finished as students. One of my students, in fact, while he was an undergraduate, formed an organization called Students Helping Honduras that raised over $3 million to completely rebuild a village in Honduras. What is possible is amazing. So as my hero, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, we have come a long way, but we have a long, long way to go. In 30 years of work against genocide, I've learned 3 things about genocide prevention. The first lesson is the direct result of our own human incapacity to comprehend or feel sympathy for large groups of people who are halfway around the world. We've talked about that. What that means is we need to create permanent institutions that will be established to watch out for the precursors of genocide and be organized and ready to move fast when it begins. But even more so, we need to create permanent institutions to educate our populations at the local and national level about the early warning signs and about what can prevent genocide in their countries so they can take action, so it won't ever get to the point of genocide. These are the kind of permanent institutional changes that we need in the world. And that's what Genocide Watch is going to be focusing on. And we're about to hear from Dr. James Smith, one of my dear friends, who is the head of the Aegis Trust, and he is going to give you a really wonderful example of how they have done this in Rwanda. So institutions are necessary, and it's why in 1999 I proposed the creation of the UN Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide, and it's why we created in 1999 the International Alliance to End Genocide. Genocide Watch, I know this will be hard for you to believe, was the first anti-genocide organization in the world. I looked around and I said, why aren't there others? The Aegis Trust came soon, about the same time, right thereafter. And it was incredible to me. I mean, we had other human rights groups. Amnesty was very good. Human Rights Watch was very good. And there were others as well. The International Crisis Group was just beginning. But there were no anti-genocide organizations. What I realized was that the aim of Genocide Watch should be not to create yet another human rights empire. You know, not another pyramid that ends in London or Washington or Paris or some other Western capital. Instead, to create a whole network of anti-genocide organizations around the world that is made up of people from every nation around the world, where especially nations that are at risk. And so that's what we're building. Right now, there are 50 organizations that are part of our International Alliance, and I'm hoping that by the end of this next 10 years, we'll have 1,000. That's what it took to finally get the International Criminal Court, 1,000 organizations. The international campaign for the responsibility to protect already has nearly 1,000. So I see a real connection there that we could really work with them on that coalition building. Unfortunately, even though we create institutions for action, they don't always do their job well. President Obama created the Atrocities Prevention Board in the United States, but unfortunately it has not taken action to try to stop the bombing of the Nuba Mountains and Darfur, and action against essentially what is a genocide going on there right now. I think there's a pretty, there are some pretty, let us say, non-military ways to deal with this that would still use our military resources. In order to bomb the Nuba Mountains and Darfur, the Sudanese government has to use its Antonov bombers and its helicopter gunships. What I would do is wait until those bombers and those helicopter gunships have landed at night, and they always do. And in fact, they gather them together. And then I'd send in one of those drones and destroy them with Predator missiles. Now, I'm not advocating the killing of a single Sudanese there. What I'm doing is advocating the destruction of the killing machines. I think Omar al-Bashir would get the point. I think he would. He is not an irrational man. I think he'd realize we're finally serious about stopping this genocide. The UN has simply failed to stop it. But regional alliances like NATO, ASEAN, which acted in East Timor, the OAS, which acted when Nicaragua actually tried to invade Costa Rica. How many of you were aware of that? I don't know. That was just a few years ago. So the Organization of American States sent a diplomatic delegation down to talk to the leaders of Nicaragua and say, you get your troops the hell out of Costa Rica, or we're going to expel you from the OAS. Well, the Nicaraguans listened, and they did. And the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which is led by Nigeria, did exactly the same thing when the Central African Republic recently had a coup d'etat, and the ECOWAS said, look, you either have elections within a few months and finally have an elected government, or we're going to, and in fact they did immediately expel them from ECOWAS and from the African Union until they do have these elections. And that made a big impression on the government that took over. I think also we need to create a couple more institutions. The International Criminal Court needs an optional protocol to create an international police force that has the sole mandate to arrest leaders indicted by the ICC. I don't mean, you know, a police force hovering over us with black helicopters, you know, that can swoop down and grab you for, disobeying a parking meter violation. I mean only to enforce indictments by the ICC for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. This police force could be created without any action at all by the UN, so it couldn't be stymied by the veto. It could be done through a treaty among the Assembly of States parties to the ICC. The second lesson I've learned is that genocide must start and be led by people from countries at risk, at the local and regional and national level. It cannot be led by an American organization in Washington, D.C. $100 million was pledged to the Save Darfur campaign 7 years ago. Most of that's gone now. It didn't stop the genocide in Sudan. And I think the main reason was that the organizations that were created by it, Save Darfur Coalition, Enough, Genocide Intervention Network, and others, didn't apply that money instead to build up organizations in Sudan and in other African countries that could, in fact, put the pressure on where it needed to be put on to stop this genocide. They also didn't understand that our foreign policy is made by the executive branch, not by our congressmen and our senators, but that's another story. What I would argue is that a real international alliance needs to have and support local efforts. And right now I'm completing a book, which I intend to make an e-book really, really cheap, and so it can be used by students all over the world and translated into every language of people who want it. I'm sure the Kinyarwandan edition will be translated by one of my interns who just finished her internship, who speaks Kinyarwandan. And she's in fact just gone to Rwanda, and she is going to be working with the Comité National pour la Lutte contre le Génocide, the National Committee for the Struggle Against Genocide. It'll get translated and it'll be free on the internet. It'll also be a printable book. I mean, if you do it through Amazon, you can have it both ways. Let me make a third point, and this may sound a little bit unusual to you, but it's something, it's the elephant in the room that almost nobody ever thinks about. The third lesson I have learned about the effort to end genocide is that every nation must educate and empower women. I believe that women's empowerment is the single most important thing that the anti-genocide movement can do. And I want to give you a very good example of it. Some of you may know this example. Lima Gabawi, who was a fish seller in Monrovia, Liberia, had a strange dream one night. She dreamed that the market women of Monrovia should begin each week with an hour of prayer for peace in Liberia, which was a country that was then torn apart by civil war between Charles Taylor's government and the Revolutionary United Front. Both sides cut off arms and hands, raped women, conscripted child soldiers, and turned them into killers on drugs. They committed every war crime imaginable. She told her dream to a Muslim friend who also sold fish in the market. And they began those weekly prayer meetings in the fish market. And they grew, and they grew, and they grew. More and more women joined until 5,000 women were praying every week. And Charles Taylor's entourage would drive blithely by, chuckling away in their Mercedes limousines. Then Lima Gabawi and the other women demanded a meeting with Taylor and with the leaders of the RUF, the Revolutionary United Front. And they finally agreed to this. Both sides agreed. When they met Taylor, the women demanded an immediate ceasefire, and with the RUF also, and negotiations to end the war. And both sides agreed. In fact, Taylor went so far as to say he would be willing to step down if that was the condition of peace. So very quickly thereafter, and there was still international pressure also being put on the Taylor regime, talks began in Accra, Ghana. But the women didn't trust the men. They were right not to. They didn't trust the men to make peace. So they pooled their nickels and quarters, they rented buses, and they went to Accra themselves. And they slept out in the rain while the men slept in 4-star hotels. And the talks between the men, led by a former Nigerian president, went nowhere. And finally, fed up, the women walked into the building where the talks were underway and sat down in the hallways. Now, I'm a child of the 60s, and I can remember the sit-ins. The Ghanaian police threatened to arrest them. And so finally, Lima Gabawi herself stood up and said, okay, I'll make it very easy for you. I'll just take off all my clothes. Now, in West Africa, one of the most humiliating things that can happen to a man is for someone of her age to disrobe in front of him voluntarily and in public. And so the police simply backed off. And the Nigerian who was mediating the talks told the men that if they didn't come to an agreement within 3 days, he would turn the talks over to the women. And the men came to an agreement in 3 days, which included the exile of Charles Taylor to Nigeria. Well, peace returned to Liberia, and in the next election, with the women's crucial votes, Dr. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became the first woman elected president of an African country. Lima Gabawi, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and the Yemeni woman human rights activist Tawakkul Karman won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. And Charles Taylor was tried for his crimes and convicted, and he will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. His son will, too. To end genocide, it's going to take love. Love that transcends all the boundaries, that allows us to identify with people halfway around the world, to feel their suffering. To end genocide, it will take justice that tries the serial killers that commit genocide. And we should never lose hope in the power of love. Because love is God's force personally expressed. It is the most powerful force in the world. And we must never lose faith in the power of justice, because justice is God's force socially expressed. And Martin Luther King and Gandhi and some of the other great moral teachers of mankind have understood that it is the same force that made the stars. With love and justice together, we can end genocide. Thank you.